The high street is in crisis. There's been a lot of media coverage even before the pandemic about the decline of the high street. And in response to this, the High Streets Task Force has been working to find different ways of reviving the high street. Over the past few months, there's been a call for landscape architects, landscape managers and landscape planners to come forward and to work with the High Streets Task Force and to offer their approach to how we might revive what is basically the heart of our towns and cities. I'm delighted this afternoon to welcome 3 landscape architects. 2 of them are already engaged with the High Streets Task Force, and one of them has recently been the winner of our competition on transforming the urban landscape. So I'd like to offer a warm welcome to Katherine Xavier, to Juan Dominguez, and Adam Greatrix. And I'm going to ask each of them to say a few words by way of introduction. If we could start with Katherine.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for that. Yes, so I'm Katherine Xavier, and I've been a landscape architect for over 20 years now. And I started my own company, Garda, just over 4 years ago. I've only recently joined the High Streets Task Force, but I'm very much looking forward to working collaboratively with people to try and obviously enhance the high street. And high street design, urban design, public realm design is a passion of mine.
Great, thank you. Juan.
Hi, Paul. Thanks. So my name is Juan Dominguez. I am a landscape architect at Arup. I cover mostly the West region, so Cardiff, Bristol, and Winchester, but I also collaborate a lot with the London office. And I'm specialized in public realm improvements and sustainable urban drainage systems in relation to retrofit of green infrastructure in main city centres.
Great, thank you. Adam.
Well, my name's Adam Greatrix, and I'm the associate partner for the Gillespie's Leeds office. I've been working for Gillespie's now almost 20 years. My experience lies in urban regeneration and public realm implementation. The Landscape Institute's Transform the Urban Landscape competition recently really highlights my passion and enthusiasm for sustainable design and responding to the climate emergency.
Great, thank you. So what we want to do over the next half hour is to look at the way in which landscape practitioners can have a huge impact on the way in which we design, revive, or indeed rethink our approaches to the high street. And all 3 of our guests, I've asked the same question, which is to say, what is the most persuasive argument for investing in landscape management, landscape planning, and landscape design in reviving the high street? And I'd like to start with Katherine for you to just explain your thoughts on this.
So, Paul, I think that to answer your question, it is the celebration of successful schemes where landscape architecture and urban design have been fundamental and a key driver. My passion for urban design and landscaping really came about when I moved to Sheffield in the mid-90s. So when I lived in Sheffield, first time around, they'd just built Meadowhall, and basically it devastated the retail sector in the city centre. And I can remember walking around the city centre with shop frontages empty and a real appearance of neglect, and it was pretty bleak and depressing. And I have to say, it seems like it's a very similar situation now. The pictures that we're seeing of the high street with COVID and internet shopping pretty much decimating the retail and, of course, now the hospitality sector. But I have to say that when I returned to Sheffield 10 years later, it had undergone an unrecognisable transformation. And I can recall walking through the Winter Garden and then sitting in the Peace Garden on a warm spring afternoon, watching people gather and relax in the green oasis. The place was completely transformed and it was thriving. The Sheffield heart of the city was a £130 million major regeneration scheme in Sheffield, which began in 2004 and was completed in 2016. The Winter Garden and the Peace Garden, which were designed by the Council Landscape Architects, was phase 1 of this ambitious plan, and high quality public realm has been a top priority ever since. And I have to say that the public realm was a real catalyst for the rest of the transformation. And I think it's a really good example of how public realm and landscape architecture can really kind of lead such a transformation of a city centre. As we move into a post-COVID landscape, I think we need to provide places that fosters interaction between people and creates an experience. So it's the experience that is important. It's a new relationship between people and a new relationship between people and place. And that is where landscape architects come into it. And I think post-COVID, we will all want to live again and be part of a community and part of a place. In terms of experience, I'm currently working on the redesign of a shopping precinct in Summertown, which is just north of Oxford. And I'll just move my screen on. And our client is the Bramwell family, who are keen benefactors of the arts. And they were very keen to see a close link between art and landscape. And so we led the process of the redevelopment and redesign of the precinct, but working very closely with arts coordinator Bridget Edwards at Agency. And we were part of the team that selected the artist, who is Elisa Artesero. And so even though we designed the landscaping, we collaborated very closely with her to try and enhance the experience of the street and the landscaping. So this is an illustration of the scheme produced by the architect, which shows clearly that we've got seating, planting, the usual landscape structure. And it was an extension of the existing precinct. And this is just a little bit further down. And you can see it's perfectly pleasant. It has quite a lot of tree planting and external seating. But Elisa was brought in to really enhance the experience. And as I said, we worked very closely with her. And we tried very carefully to implement her artistic design into the landscape. So they were working very much hand in hand. And her design consisted of sun and moon inspired sculptures. So you have the moon at the north, the sun at the south. And they're both conducting a conversation that is ignited at night through magical light and shadow poetry cast across the floor from benches lining the walkway. So again, we designed the benches to try and encompass her artistic installation. So this slide shows the sun sculpture, and we were able to model the sculpture and the rest of the scheme in Vectorworks. So we could then see how it looked as you were approaching the street from different angles and how it would work effectively with the light. And you can also see in the slide that we've got we've got the artist showing how it's going to work, and we were testing out different types of materials. So really this indicates, or it shows how landscape architects can lead and work with other consultants to deliver a high street that is able to conjure up an experience, as well as just providing function and form. Thanks, Paul.
Great, Katherine, thank you very much. And now we turn to Juan.
I do think that probably the benefit for the economy, I would say, is probably one of the strongest arguments in favor of investing in landscape architecture and planning, especially for the regeneration of the high streets. I think we should move towards a high street that shifts the focus from consumption to maybe a more human-centered approach that allows people to connect with their communities and with nature. So perhaps a high street where the aim maybe not just selling products, but selling experiences, as Katherine was mentioning, and again, encouraging people to connect with each other. So we know that these connections are key to people's health and well-being. as we have seen during this pandemic, many people were struggling because they can't connect with their loved ones, they can't socialize. So spaces that encourage and promote this social interaction, I think, will result in a benefit for the health and well-being of individuals, and ultimately for the NHS to take pressure from the NHS and basically produce a economic benefit that can be measured. So I also believe that the high street, the changes on the high street can be a catalyst for a more resilient built environment where perhaps sustainable drainage and biodiversity play a key role. So a more resilient high street would, in the long term, help fight climate change with the related economic benefits as well. So just to summarize and to answer Paul's question, I think showing the economic benefit and the benefit to the environment are the two major arguments to justify this type of investment. And
Great.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much. Adam, now your prize-winning, award-winning street was not technically a high street, but clearly there's a lot of lessons there for high street. So tell us a bit about what you did.
Sure. The slow decline of our high streets and the more recent pandemic has, of course, a devastating effect on businesses and people's lives. But for me, the far bigger challenge to society remains the climate emergency. And it's something we really have to act on now. One facet to the climate emergency is the rewilding of our urban environment, allowing nature back into our towns and cities, promoting natural processes and ecosystems to re-establish themselves. This is not only essential to conserve and repair habitats, promote species diversity and resilient landscapes, but it's also fundamental for our own physical and mental health and well-being. Our recent competition entry for the LI's Transforming the Urban Landscape, in which we collaborated with our good friend Hilary Barber on, is entitled Back Down to Earth. And although it has a number of sustainability, post-COVID and smart city themes in it, it is essentially an exploration of how we can rewild our existing streets. Importantly, this proposal is aimed at all those unremarkable streets when land use and movement patterns are maybe less intense than the main high street, and where there's real opportunity to green them up and incrementally start to enrich the environmental fabric of our cities. Back Down to Earth represents an ecosystem-led planning approach where people and nature have equal importance in a space. Our proposal peels away the grey carpet, literally back down to earth, allowing the soil to breathe and to become a thriving ecosystem and provide the foundation for a healthier, greener, and more resilient streetscape. This soil life support system allows for the establishment of extensive swathes of biodiverse and rich planting, and the planting of trees wherever practically possible that can reach maturity as part of a wider urban forestry strategy to act as the green lungs and to sequester carbon. The ground once again can act as a sponge, capturing and storing rainwater to reduce flooding. To maintain access for people and cyclists and vehicles, a lightweight modular recycled plastic road system could be used that can be installed very quickly and efficiently and is adaptable for the future. The lightweight raft treads lightly, allowing the underlying soil to be an interconnected system and planting to permeate through. The hollow road structure could also be used to roll out district heating systems and ultra-fast fibre to an area. The re-engineered streets could harness pioneering new technologies and sustainable energy sources to promote the public realm as a landscape battery. A smart city approach where the streets could be digitally enhanced to monitor modal movements in real time to provide pedestrian and cycle priority, and wayfinding and signage embedded in surfaces to reduce clutter. And of course, this proposal is also for people. In a response to the post-COVID world, we've included translucent canopies to create a kind of chromatic skin, blurring the boundaries between indoor and outdoor space to create an all-weather environment for communal and business activity, and importantly, social space to engender a sense of community and local identity within the street. And something I'm very passionate about is the intensification of our urban environments, maximising roof space for community areas, urban agriculture, energy generation, and even using our rooftops for servicing the buildings via drones rather than use service vehicles to the front door. For the Back Down to Earth study, we're of course the curators of this urban vision, but the recognition also goes to the scientists and the researchers and the engineers who are already developing many of the technologies that we've illustrated in our proposal that will really help to society to tackle the climate emergency. And as a profession, landscape architects are fortunate that our work overlaps with so many other disciplines and fields of expertise, and reinforces a key point that these kind of collaborations are vital if we're to deliver real change.
Adam, thank you very much. So we've got here in these three presentations a number of really interesting overlapping themes. The role of art, the importance of responding to climate emergency and developing climate resilience, a human-centered approach in the creation of social spaces, and a commitment to rewilding. So the first question I'd like to ask all of you is around technical limitations. What do you think, or what do you most worry about persuading your clients, your planners, or others to allow you to do the kind of things which you have outlined?
I think if I start, Paul,
Please do.
I think there's a number of key challenges really to rewilding. The relatability and scale of the climate emergency at an individual street or project level, I think is daunting and almost abstract. It's easy for sustainable issues to be dismissed or responded to in a tokenistic manner when considered against the more tangible short-term objectives. For me, the climate agenda needs to be a fundamental part of the decision-making process on projects if we're serious about investing in a sustainable future.
Okay, Katherine, what are your thoughts on the technical inhibitions?
I would follow on from what Adam's just said in the case that I don't think that the limitations are of a technical nature. I think that it's usually lack of ambition, leadership, which then leads to poor collaboration is the kind of key issue. I think the vision needs to be clear and collective, buy-in must be achieved. And then I think actually anything is possible, pretty much. If you don't mind, can I just show a slide?
Of course, please do.
Because basically I want to talk just very, very briefly about a client that we're working with in St Helier. And this is Horizon is one project we're working with them on. And it's a big residential scheme with streets and retail and shops and cafes and bars and everything on the ground floor. But it's a waterfront development, overlooks the marina, so fantastic location. But what has been, I think, a real eye-opener with this scheme is that the client project manager is a landscape architect. So they're very aware of the importance of landscape architecture. And we were brought in at the very outset of the project, which meant that we could have conversations with the other consultants really early on about, for example, where they put the basement slab. So we could then ensure that, we could put proper planting in place on top, proper, good sized trees. Also talking about, as Juan was talking about, thinking about how we can provide, better SUD solutions. So all the way down the street, we have rain gardens, which collects the water and then it can be reused. So looking at systems like that and working with the drainage engineer as to how we can actually achieve that. So I think if we're brought on board early and the client understands the importance of landscape architecture and everybody has buy-in, I believe that actually limitations become fewer and fewer, technical limitations, that is.
Great, thank you. So Juan, what are your thoughts on technical limitations?
I completely agree with my colleagues here. think probably the limitations, maybe they're not technical, they're from different kind. Probably, the willingness of the local governments and stakeholders, and maybe the challenges are more in the planning system rather than being technical. I think the high street of the future will need to be a much more flexible space than nowadays, both for businesses and for the public realm. So businesses might need to adapt more quickly to changing demand due to, for instance, climate events, where shifting quickly from serving on premises to local delivery could be very important for the survival of such businesses. So I think the new high street needs to be very, very flexible. And that needs to be accommodated in the planning system, I guess, and on each of the local authorities' development plans. So I'm thinking about, for instance, the recent climate events, extreme climate events that we've seen in Spain, Texas. I don't think these are exceptions. These are going to be more frequent every year. In Madrid, for instance, it's been a very, very big snow event last month, and 70% of the street trees have been seriously damaged. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge cost for the city. In Texas, thousands of people have been without electricity or running water for days. So we need to prepare our streets to be more resilient to these events. And this involves the spatial layouts, but also the choice of materials and planting. So the other perhaps constraint that happens quite often to landscape architects, I think, is the regulations on health and safety. And it's probably too early to understand how COVID-19 will impact in the medium or long-term future of public spaces. But I would think the obvious one is that there's going to be a need for more flexible spaces that can adapt to different needs, where social distance perhaps is always accommodated. So I'm thinking about street furniture that maybe is mobile, or even trees or planting that can be moved around to accommodate different situations. So I think the flexibility is going to be one of the main elements in high streets of the future.
You've raised a really interesting question there about the impact of the pandemic. Can I ask you to reflect just over the past year? Clearly, public space, what we do with cycling, what we do with pedestrian access, how we use cars, has received an astonishing level of interest and publicity. This may not go on forever, because I've noticed just over the past few weeks, for example, in London, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea removed a newly installed cycle path. And only the other day, again in London, one of the taxi drivers associations managed to persuade the High Court that the Mayor of London was illegal in attempting to give priority to cycling over vehicle traffic. So we're in a very interesting moment where we've observed quite a lot of quite significant changes to the highway, to public spaces, but there's also a bit of a backlash. And I just wondered what now it's almost exactly a year since our lives were significantly changed by COVID-19. So I wonder if you could just comment on what your thoughts are on how this may or may not be impacting on the way you'll be doing your work over the next few months. Perhaps, Katherine, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I think it's always been an issue, Paul, that it's hard sometimes to demonstrate the positive benefits of good landscape and urban design. And as you say, kind of winning the hearts and minds can be quite difficult. And I think really the only way really of doing that is by kind of getting in early, maybe trying to influence policy and planning guidance and SPGs. And so, for example, we were lucky enough to be involved with the Southwest St Helier planning framework. And we were able to liaise with the highways engineers, which can sometimes be a little bit tricky, trying to win them over. And we worked with them and we discussed various options in various parts of the area we were looking at. And we produced a series of images which I suppose, sold the ideas that we came up with. Sell the idea to the public, sell the idea to politicians. But if you don't mind if I just share again, I've just happened to have them, just a couple of them. So, and again, it's about kind of putting pedestrians and cyclists and sustainable transport first, and looking at, this is a really busy road. It's La Route de la Libération. And we were looking at ways in which we could try and take the vehicular dominance away and create a big boulevard and some really kind of generous crossing points. So again, using the form of visualizations to demonstrate, what it would look like. And again, this is the entrance into St. Helier from the west, at West Park, and trying to demonstrate how you could segregate in these particular locations, cyclists, pedestrians and cars and buses, everybody entering and leaving St. Helier, and how that could be achieved. So the engineers doing the calculations and us trying to then sell it through visualizations.
Thank you. Juan, in terms of persuading people to change their minds, you've already mentioned some of the major impacts of climate change. Are your clients making the link between some of the symptoms of climate change and the work that landscape architects could do in alleviating some of these?
I think they are making the link, but I imagine for any major transformation, there will be specific sectors and stakeholders that will be negatively affected, and as such, they will offer some resistance. So I believe that if we want these transformations to be implemented quickly and be successful, they will need to minimize the impact on such sectors and stakeholders. So I guess in the specific case of London taxi drivers, maybe the solution is to allow the taxis with low emission to use those bike lanes for some time. I don't know, but their interests need to be accommodated somehow. Otherwise, probably it won't be successful, this transformation, or it won't be as successful in the short term. So I think also the legislative framework is an important one as well. During this pandemic, we have seen judges turning down government initiatives to protect the public because they were not lawful or because they were against specific citizens' rights. So understanding what is the legislation, the current legislation, and understanding whether, some of that legislation needs to change before some of the transformations take place is very important. So transforming the high streets is an important task for the future of our cities and towns, but it's also a very important step to help fight climate change and ultimately to secure our survival. So if we want to win hearts and minds, we need to explain better what are the consequences of keeping things as they are, in both economic and environmental terms, which are very much interrelated. So I guess the example of London is a good one, because it shows that if you try to do something without involving all the stakeholders and the community, it's very likely that it will fail. So we also need politicians that act like leaders, and they are not just interested in winning votes. So if we're going towards a world with more pedestrianized spaces and less cars and taxis, this needs to be communicated clearly, and mitigation plans perhaps put in place to deal with these potential job losses in some sectors. So I think it needs to be an open conversation with all the stakeholders and with all the interested parties, and understanding what are the impacts on all fronts. That's probably the key to the success of this transformation.
Adam, what's fascinating about your award-winning scheme is that you could have chosen a completely abstract place, but you chose the street where you work. What are you going to do to get that scheme built?
Well, we are already trying to get it built, not succeeding as yet, and maybe in our street. Going back to Catherine's point, I think we need to seize the moment really and act quite quickly before things do return back to the new normal. And I think pilot schemes are a good way of promoting change and attitudes and testing ideas. That's something the Scandinavian cities do incredibly well. using small pilot projects and then rolling them out if they're successful. So that's something, to answer your question, that's something we're trying to do. We're trying to see if we can create this as a demonstrator project somewhere, trying to find a developer or a local authority partner to try it out. Imagine if every town and city in the country dedicated a street or space to rewilding straight away as a demonstrator project, how fascinating that would be.
And also, do you think that, I mean, the language is changing? Because I can remember a time when rewilding was a phrase that would not be used very much on TV, and yet I've heard it really quite a lot over the past few weeks. So if you'd go to your local authority and say, we want to rewild the centre of Leeds, do you think you might now get a rather more sympathetic approach than you might have done 5 years ago?
Of course, and rewilding is a very broad title, really. It does cover a range of things. In this instance, I think there is a lot of inertia or scepticism to rewilding, and maybe a lack of understanding. And I think that's the point of creating demonstrator or pilot projects, is that actually you can use them as a living lab test bed to show the metrics of how they can benefit people physically, socially, and the ecological benefits, and demonstrate to the policymakers and the decision makers actually that these can be achieved. So I think it's very much about to engender support. I think we've actually got to test these ideas and get them working quite quickly within our urban areas.
And let me ask you, Katherine, you started your presentation by giving the very good example of Sheffield. And in fact, a lot of the gold route in Sheffield and the Peace Gardens, I mean, that was done maybe 10 years ago. So I suppose the other question is, how come they managed to do it so successfully? And what can that teach others?
I think, again, Paul, it's down to collaboration and leadership. I think that Sheffield One, who kind of led the whole transformation, there were very strong partnership between public and private. I don't quite know how they managed to foster that part, the very close partnership that they had, but they did. And I think that, again, maybe the close collaboration between the landscape architects at the local authority and their colleagues, but again, they work together very closely. So yeah, I think it's down to leadership and good direction, good collaboration. And I think also one thing about Sheffield as well was that it was managed very well. It wasn't just a capital project. It was properly funded, properly managed. And, even, years and years after it had been implemented, it still looked great, and it's still thriving in terms of urban design. So I think all of those things, but I think it always leads back to the leadership and collaboration.
So I'd like to ask you all one closing question, is if you could imagine what it would be like doing your jobs 5 years from now, can you tell me, maybe just in the street where you live or the street where you work, what do you hope to see in your neighbourhood, in your high street 5 years from now? Maybe let's start with Adam.
Well, keeping on the rewilding theme, I mean, I'd really like to see streets which are shared between people and nature. I think ultimately society has got to start making some short-term compromises, even sacrifices within our urban areas to allow nature back in. The benefit is all in the longer term. So I'd really like to see rewilding becoming a mainstream design initiative within our towns and cities.
Right.
I would, of course, love to be involved with that.
Adam, thank you. Juan, what would you like to see 5 years from now?
Yeah, I completely agree with Adam, but maybe I would say that also I would really like to see the streets almost like an extension of your home, where people feel, safe, where people feel encouraged to interact socially, and maybe bring back that sense of community that maybe we're losing in the last, 20, 30 years. And that's where the high streets probably play a very important role, because people tend to gather where they shop and where they can go to restaurants, etc. So I think I would like more interaction between people on the streets.
Brilliant, thank you. And Katherine, 5 years from now, what would you like to be looking at?
I mean, I completely agree with Adam and Juan in the sense that I want to see much greener streets and a greater sense of community, certainly in terms of the high streets. But I think I'd like, as a professional, I think I'd like to walk into a team meeting and for everyone to take landscape architecture seriously and to embrace the new systems that we have and the new technologies that we have, embrace it, and so we can actually realize, the vision that we have as landscape architects. But I think it's for us also to have to engage in those conversations and to move it forward.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for engaging in this conversation today. I think you've put forward a really fascinating vision of hopefully where we'll be 5 years from now. So Adam, Juan, and Katherine, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.